The wind howled through the hollow streets as Claire parked her car in the driveway of the old family home. The house had been in their family for generations, but it had stood vacant for years after her grandmother passed away. Tonight, it would be her refuge. She was alone, miles away from the city chaos, seeking peace after a grueling week. The house seemed to loom larger than she remembered, its cracked windows and peeling paint whispering tales of neglect and forgotten memories. She tightened her coat around herself, clutching the key her mother had handed her, and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and dust. Claire flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. With a groan, she realized she'd have to rely on her flashlight until she could figure out the fuse box. The narrow beam of light danced across the walls, revealing old photographs, antique furniture covered in white sheets, and shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The first hour passed uneventfully. She unpacked her overnight bag, made herself some tea on a portable stove she'd brought along, and curled up in the living room with her phone. But as the night deepened, the house seemed to shift around her. Every creak of the wooden floorboards and distant rustle made her glance over her shoulder. She told herself it was just the house settling. Nothing unusual for a structure this old. At midnight, the whispers began. Claire had just started dozing off on the couch when she heard it. A faint, unintelligible murmur. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Silent. She shook her head, trying to convince herself she had imagined it. But then she heard it again, clearer this time. The sound seemed to come from the walls, as if the house itself was speaking. She grabbed her flashlight and stood up, her legs trembling. "Who's there?" she demanded, the words echoing back to her. The whispers stopped, replaced by the groan of the wind outside. Claire laughed nervously, cursing her imagination. She decided to check upstairs. Her grandmother's room had always felt the safest when she was a child. As she climbed the creaking staircase, the air grew colder, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top, she found the door slightly ajar, just as she had left it earlier. But something felt off. The room was darker than it should have been, even with her flashlight. The beam seemed to be swallowed by the shadows, leaving the edges of the room shrouded in blackness. Claire stepped inside and froze. The old rocking chair by the window was moving, its rhythmic creak cutting through the silence. She held her breath, gripping the flashlight tightly. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. But as she shined the light on the chair, it stopped abruptly. The room fell deathly silent. Then came the voice. It was faint at first, almost like a sigh, but it grew louder, more distinct. "Why are you here?" The words were drawn out, each one dripping with malice. Claire stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. In the darkness, she felt the cold brush of something against her arm, like icy fingers. She bolted out of the room, her heart racing as she ran down the stairs. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. They weren't just coming from the walls anymore. They seemed to echo from every corner of the house. "Get out. Leave. Now." The words overlapped, forming a cacophony of dread. Claire reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. Her hands shook as she turned the key, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had decided to trap her. Panic set in as the whispers turned to laughter. Low, guttural and mocking. Tears streamed down her face as she pounded on the door, screaming for help. And then everything stopped. The whispers, the laughter, even the wind outside fell silent. Claire turned around, her back pressed against the door. In the center of the living room stood a figure, It was shadowy, almost featureless, but its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice deep and resonant. Claire's scream caught in her throat as the figure moved closer. The room seemed to twist around her, the walls closing in. She closed her eyes, praying this was all a nightmare. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. The house was quiet once more, eerily so. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open behind her. Claire didn't think twice. She grabbed her bag and fled into the night, not stopping until she reached her car. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood still and dark, but in one of the windows, she swore she saw the faint outline of a figure watching her leave. She never went back to the house. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake to the sound of whispers in her own home, faint and distant, as if they had followed her, waiting for her to return.